Have you ever wondered what the sin is that leads the most souls to hell? This revelation from Padre Pio, our beloved saint, known for his deep spiritual connection and impressive mystical gifts, left us with a warning that we cannot ignore. In a world where it is increasingly difficult to distinguish between good and evil, where temptations surround us everywhere, Padre Pio's words resonate with a truth that we need to hear now more than ever. Padre Pio spent countless hours in the confessional, listening to the sins and struggles of thousands of people. It was through this extraordinary experience that he was able to clearly identify which sin dragged the most souls to perdition. And the most surprising thing is that it was not the one many would imagine. During his years of ministry, he observed a disturbing pattern. While some sins were obvious and easy to recognize, there was one in particular that acted more subtly, more deceitfully, leading souls down a path of destruction without them even realizing it. This sin, which we will reveal today, has the power to darken the mind and harden the heart to the point where the person becomes blind to their own spiritual condition. What is most alarming is that it is more present in our daily lives than we might imagine. So normalized in today's society that we often do not even identify it as a threat to the soul. Padre Pio firmly warned how this sin had become a true spiritual epidemic, especially affecting our generation. However, not all is hopeless, because along with this warning, he also left us the necessary tools to protect and free ourselves from this evil. Throughout this message, you will not only discover what this dangerous sin is, but you will also learn practical and powerful strategies to keep your soul safe. What makes this message so special is that it is not just a warning, but a path to spiritual freedom. With his compassion and wisdom, Padre Pio offers us a clear guide to recognizing the signs of this sin in our lives, and more importantly, he shows us how we can overcome it. As we delve deeper, you will understand why this sin has such a devastating power to distance souls from salvation, how it operates in the mind and heart, and why it is crucial to be alert to its influence. But the most valuable thing of all is that you will learn how to strengthen your soul against this spiritual threat with the teachings that Padre Pio left us. His words have the power to open our eyes to a reality that we may have ignored for too long. Although they were spoken decades ago, they seem to have been written specifically for our time, for our generation, for the unique challenges we face today. We must not forget that Padre Pio was not an ordinary saint. His experience in the confessional, where he spent up to 16 hours a day listening to confessions, gave him an extraordinary perspective on the battle between good and evil in the human soul. Combining this with his mystical gifts, he was able to see beyond the excuses and justifications we often give ourselves. For years, thousands of people traveled from all corners of the world to confess to him. Why? Because he had the special gift of reading souls, he could see a person's spiritual state with astonishing clarity. This unique ability allowed him to identify the most dangerous patterns that led souls to perdition. In his writings and spiritual advice, he constantly pointed out how certain sins create a chain of events that gradually distance the soul from grace. But there was one in particular that concerned him more than any other, a sin that, according to him, had the power to completely blind the soul to its own spiritual condition. What makes his warning so relevant is his deep knowledge of how this sin operates in the human soul. It is not merely an external action, but a state of the heart that slowly corrupts our ability to discern between good and evil. It is a spiritual poison that works silently, numbing the conscience to the point where we stop recognizing the danger we are in. With great concern, Padre Pio observed how this particular sin had the unique ability to justify itself. He saw how people who fell into it developed a complex system of self-justification, convincing themselves that their actions were not so serious, or that circumstances made them acceptable. In his conversations with penitents, Padre Pio tried to make them see this subtle and dangerous trap, guiding them toward true conversion. His mission was not only to point out error, but to show the way back to grace. Today, his teachings are more relevant than ever. They remind us that, although this sin may be deeply rooted in our daily lives, there is always the possibility of redemption. With humility and sincerity, we can open our eyes to our true spiritual condition and take the path of conversion. Only then can we overcome this silent enemy and walk with confidence toward the light of God. Padre Pio repeatedly emphasized how this sin has a unique characteristic. It becomes linked to others, creating a cycle that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. It is like a door that, once opened, allows a series of spiritual evils to enter, gradually taking control of our lives. One of his most insightful observations was how this sin affected our relationship with the sacraments. He noticed that those who fell into its trap began to distance themselves from the confessional, not because they had lost their faith, but because the weight of their pride prevented them from recognizing and admitting their true spiritual condition. For the saint of Pietrelcina, this was one of the reasons why this sin was so dangerous. He warned that it had the power to numb our spiritual sensitivity to the point that, unlike other sins that generate immediate remorse, this one silences the voice of conscience, making us gradually immune to the inspirations of grace. In his experience in the confessional, he observed that it not only affected individuals, but that its impact extended to entire families and communities. He saw how this sin was passed down from generation to generation, creating a pattern of behaviors and attitudes that led many away from the path of salvation. After this deep spiritual preparation, we come to the moment of revealing what this sin is, that Padre Pio identified as the most dangerous for our soul: pride. Yes, spiritual pride, that subtle sin that disguises itself as virtue, and that he described as the stronghold of all other sins. He pointed to it as the most dangerous because it is the only one capable of corrupting even our good actions. While other sins are clearly harmful, pride has the unique ability to infiltrate our virtues, transforming them into instruments of our own spiritual destruction. Padre Pio observed how pride manifested itself in increasingly subtle ways in modern life. It was not limited to external vanity or obvious arrogance. The pride that concerned him most was the one that hid behind the appearance of moral righteousness and spiritual superiority. In his spiritual advice, he warned that pride begins almost imperceptibly, with small thoughts of superiority, subtle comparisons with others, seemingly justified judgments about others' faults. Over time, these thoughts build a fortress of self-justification that blinds us to our own spiritual condition. The most alarming aspect of this sin, according to Padre Pio, is its ability to resist even experiences that would normally lead us to repentance. While other sins may make us feel guilt or shame and push us to seek forgiveness, pride has the unique ability to turn even our failures into justifications and excuses. It is a silent poison that hardens the heart and separates it from divine mercy, convincing us that our sins are not so serious, that our faults are understandable, that our spiritual path is superior to that of others. Before continuing to delve into these revelations from Padre Pio, I want to invite you to be part of this spiritual family. If these messages are resonating in your heart and you feel they could help others, you can support this space by becoming a member of the channel. Also, if this message is touching your soul, don't forget to click "Thank you" below the video. Your support allows us to continue sharing these valuable teachings from Padre Pio that can transform the lives of many people. Padre Pio explained that pride is especially dangerous because it directly attacks our ability to receive grace. While other sins may leave us feeling unworthy or ashamed, pride makes us feel that we do not need mercy. convinces us that our actions are justified and that our faith is superior to that of others. In his years of ministry, he observed how pride had the ability to create a false spirituality. People who externally appeared very devout, who fulfilled all religious practices, but who internally were separated from true grace. This form of pride is particularly dangerous because it hides behind a mask of piety. Padre Pio warned about how it can manifest even in our spiritual practices. When we begin to feel superior because of our devotions, when we judge the faith of others as inferior to our own, when we stop examining our own hearts because we believe we are on the right path without the possibility of error, that is when this sin has taken root in our soul. Understanding this warning is not a reason for fear, but for hope. Padre Pio did not only point out the danger of pride, he also gave us tools to fight it. Humility, sincere prayer, openness to the sacrament of confession, and the ability to recognize our own faults are key to freeing ourselves from this spiritual trap. It is a call to examine our lives with honesty, to ask God for the grace to see ourselves as we truly are, and to remember that true greatness is not found in feeling superior to others, but in approaching God with a humble heart, willing to be transformed. We believe that our spiritual journey makes us better than others, and without realizing it, pride begins to corrupt our interior life from within. One of Padre Pio's most penetrating observations was how this sin has the ability to multiply within the family and social environment. A proud person does not only harm themselves, but tends to create an influence that infects others with the same sin. Proud parents raise proud children, proud leaders form proud communities, and over time, the cycle perpetuates itself in a silent yet devastating way. The saint warned that pride is especially dangerous in our modern era, where personal autonomy and individualism are exalted as supreme values. It makes us believe that we are completely self-sufficient, that we do not need the guidance of the church or tradition, that we can interpret spiritual truths according to our own judgment. This form of pride is particularly destructive because it isolates us from the sources of grace we need for our salvation. What is most concerning is that Padre Pio observed how pride has the power to persist until the very last moment. While other sins may lead us to repentance, even on our deathbed, pride can keep us blind until the end, preventing us from recognizing our need for God. For this reason, he considered it the most dangerous sin for the salvation of the soul. Now that we understand the seriousness of pride and its destructive power, Padre Pio offers us a clear path to combat it in our lives. His advice, born from years of spiritual experience, provides us with practical tools to cultivate humility and protect our souls from this silent poison. The first recommendation he gives us is to develop the habit of sincere self-examination, dedicating a few minutes each night to reviewing our attitudes throughout the day, paying special attention to moments when we felt superior to others or justified our faults. This exercise, though simple, helps us identify the subtle manifestations of pride in our lives before they take deeper root. The saint also emphasized the importance of regular confession, but not as a mere formality, rather as an act of true conversion. He taught that a superficial confession is useless if it is not accompanied by a deep examination of conscience, especially regarding the ways in which pride has manifested in our thoughts, words, and actions. He advised approaching confession with humility and sincerity, recognizing not only our failures, but also our tendency to justify or minimize our faults. Another concrete exercise that Padre Pio recommended is learning to give credit to others when receiving praise. He taught that recognizing that our talents and achievements are a gift, not solely our own merit, helps us maintain the correct perspective on our abilities and successes. Similarly, he emphasized the importance of cultivating relationships of spiritual accountability, seeking the guidance of a spiritual director or a regular confessor who can help us see the subtle manifestations of pride in our lives. These individuals can offer us an objective perspective and help us recognize our blind spots. One of the most powerful practices the saint recommended is silent service. That is, performing acts of charity and help without seeking recognition. He encouraged us to practice humility through anonymous service, distancing ourselves from the need to be admired or validated by others. Learning to give without expecting anything in return is one of the most effective ways to combat pride's tendency to always seek the spotlight. Padre Pio also spoke of gratitude as an antidote to pride. He taught us that developing the habit of giving thanks daily, recognizing that everything we have and everything we are is a gift, keeps us in an attitude of dependence on God. Gratitude reminds us that we are not self-sufficient and that without divine grace, we cannot sustain ourselves. Another valuable tool he offers is the practice of humility in conversations. He advises us to listen more and speak less, resisting the temptation to constantly correct others or impose our opinions. Humility in dialogue helps us recognize that we are not always right and that we can learn even from those with whom we disagree. He also teaches us that prayer should be humble, that we must approach God not as spiritual experts but as children in need of guidance and grace. He warns us against the temptation to see ourselves as superior in our faith and encourages us to pray with simplicity, setting aside any pretense of self-sufficiency. Finally, Padre Pio gives us a particularly practical piece of advice. Learn to receive corrections with gratitude. He teaches us that, although it may sometimes be difficult to accept criticism, we must see it as an opportunity to grow in humility. Learning to accept others' observations with serenity and to reflect on them without reacting defensively is an effective way to break down the barriers that pride builds in our hearts. As we reach the end of this important message from Padre Pio, it is essential to remember that recognizing pride in our lives should not lead us to despair, but to action. The fight against this sin is not easy because it cunningly hides behind our best intentions, but with the right spiritual tools, we can weaken its influence and walk toward a humbler life in harmony with God's grace. Only when we learn to let go of the need to feel superior and open our hearts to genuine humility, do we experience the true peace that only God can give. Far from leading us to despair, recognizing pride in our lives should drive us toward hope, because identifying this sin is the first step toward true spiritual transformation. Padre Pio assures us that, although the struggle against pride is difficult, it is a battle we can win if we use the right tools and maintain a sincere disposition of the heart. Every small act of humility, every decision to put others before ourselves, is a victory on this path of inner growth. The good news is that while pride has the power to distance us from grace, humility has an even greater power to attract it. Padre Pio teaches us that every time we recognize our limitations and our dependence on grace, we open our hearts to a torrent of spiritual blessings. It is not just an external change, but a deep transformation that renews us from within. And the most important thing is to remember that we should not embark on this journey alone. The saint encourages us to rely on the community of faith, on the sacraments, and on the guidance of the Church, because every sincere confession, every act of humility, every moment of genuine prayer brings us closer to the spiritual freedom we long for. The transformation that Padre Pio proposes is neither superficial nor immediate. It is a process that begins when we honestly recognize the manifestations of pride in our lives and take concrete steps to cultivate humility. He reminds us that every day is a new opportunity to choose this path, no matter how many times we have fallen in the past. The present offers us, at every moment, the possibility of a different choice, And every act of humility, no matter how small, brings us closer to the peace that only God's grace can give. His invitation is clear. We must not ignore this warning about pride, especially in a world that increasingly celebrates and promotes it as if it were a virtue. He calls us to be aware that true power in our spiritual life does not come from our own strength or ability, but from our willingness to recognize our need for grace. When we choose the path of humility, we find a freedom and peace that pride can never offer us. The promise that Padre Pio leaves us is that by consciously working to combat pride in our lives, we not only protect our souls from its destructive power, but also open our hearts to a deeper and more authentic relationship with grace. This is the true transformation we all seek, the one that allows us to live in harmony with ourselves, with others, and with God. That is why I invite you to start putting these teachings into practice today. Begin with small acts of humility, moments of sincere self-examination, and concrete gestures of selfless service to others. Remember that every step on the path of humility is a step toward true spiritual freedom. Dear soul, if these teachings of Padre Pio have touched your heart, I invite you to express your gratitude by leaving a message of thanks. A simple gesture of acknowledgement allows more people to receive these valuable revelations and discover the path to spiritual transformation. And if you wish to continue deepening these messages of faith and protection, join this community of growth and connection. Together, we can build a space where peace and harmony become a reality in every home.